Great. Hello and welcome back to the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. It is March 2024. I'm Liza Hartley, Media Manager at UK SIF, and this podcast will look at the sustainability challenges facing the UK's housing landscape. We at UK SIF have just published the second report in our 4-part Financing the Future series, looking at housing and calling for policy reforms designed to unlock private capital to fund the green transition within the housing sector. With me to discuss the topic today is James Alexander, Chief Executive of UK SIF, and Kane Emerson, Head of Housing Research at the YIMBY Alliance, and a political activist and organiser fighting for better housing conditions across the country. Kane is also a school governor, chair of his estate's Residents Association, and treasurer of the Labour Party Irish Society. Kane, it's such a pleasure to have you with us on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Liza.
So I'd like to start with the question of a potential investor exodus. The UK risks losing out on £31 billion in private investment for green housing due to a lack of supportive policy. That's what our housing report shows. Because 63% of real estate decision makers consider moving investment elsewhere or have already done so. James, Kane, what are the key factors driving this sentiment? Perhaps we could start with you, James.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Liza, and thanks, Kane, for being with us today. I think it's going to be a great conversation. So, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I suppose the UK does have amongst the most inefficient housing stock in Europe, and that's something that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency if we are to have any chance of hitting our net zero targets or our emissions targets. We absolutely have to focus on housing. There's no two ways about it. I think in fact 22% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions come from housing. So if we choose to not look at housing, we've got absolutely no chance of hitting our targets. But I think one of the really big challenges is that investors are struggling for confidence because of the start-stop nature of policymaking. And investor confidence, as we all know, is absolutely crucial for driving investment into any sector, including housing and buildings. And we've seen this same challenge occur in transport recently with the electric vehicle targets changing. We've seen similar challenges in energy, and the energy report we just put out last month highlights some of those challenges. And the exact same is true for investor confidence in housing. And so I think we do really need to build up the investor confidence. That means policymakers working hand in hand with private investors and also corporates in that space to make sure that there is a long-term consistency of policymaking. And of course, investor trust in government policymaking is essential in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, James, about the stop-start nature of the markets at the moment, or of government announcements. So the current political landscape isn't very clear at the moment on housing and also sustainability. So I think we've had 12 housing ministers since 2010. So there's an awful lot of turnover of ministers, and when there's an awful lot of turnover of ministers, that's really impacting policy. So there is that stop-start nature of sustainability and government policy. And then we also have the kind of foundational element that is also quite unpredictable for investors, and that's planning. So it takes I think that the goal is to have major applications decided within 13 weeks. So any major application with lots of homes on one site, it can take months or even years. So if you're looking to invest in sustainable housing, then that's going to be really off-putting if planning is a big constraint in that.
Yeah, planning, of course, is also an issue in energy as well, as we've discussed. But one of the craziest things for me is after all of that planning, consideration, deliberation that happens in local authorities, you still end up with housing that needs to be retrofitted the moment the first person moves in. There's no EV charging points necessarily included. There aren't solar panels on the roofs, often still connected to the gas grid, which we know we need to move away from. So how is it that we still, after all of the unpredictable nature of planning, which I agree absolutely puts people off and puts investors off, and encourages them to think elsewhere, to move elsewhere to countries that have got better, more predictable, faster planning systems. How do we still have the situation where houses need to be retrofitted even when they're new?
So that's a very good question. And I think fundamentally it's because we are in a housing crisis. So at the moment, Britain is missing around 4.3 million homes. And so it's simple economics, supply and demand. So if you're a developer, then can get away with doing the lowest quality housing units that you can do, homes for families and people, then you'll do that because there's no competition amongst house builders, so you can put up anything. And then we also have the second issue that a lot of local authorities are underfunded in terms of regulation. So you have, for example, a recent decision in Greenwich Borough Council where there was a high-rise actually on the Thames that was built and it was contrary to the actual planning application. And the local authority then realised once the building was built and families had moved in, that they broke the planning conditions and are now asking the developer to tear down the building. So there is that issue.
Joking.
Yeah, well, no, that's the state of local authority planning departments, is that there's not enough enforcement to make sure that people are following through to build quality homes, and that really includes thinking about some of the environmental commitments that they're making.
Yeah, which when you couple that with the environmental footprint of building a new building in the first place, to then tear it down because it's not been properly reviewed or assessed while it's in the construction phase is a really serious problem.
Yeah, it is, James.
Wow. I mean, I think we've already touched on some points that we're going to come on to throughout this conversation, but I'd love to hear from you both about what I might call the green investment gap. So we know that only 15% of real estate companies view the UK as the most attractive market for sustainable investments. So I want to dig in a little bit. What are the problems here? We know there's an issue with underinvestment. We know we're losing out to other nations that are doing a better job. Let's dig into the problems a little bit more. And also, how can the UK become more competitive in attracting that green capital for the housing sector?
I mean, well, maybe we should start by digging into that statistic, because that comes from the polling that we've done as UK SIF of real estate companies in the UK. And it's wild, only 15%. So 85% of real estate companies...
And that's in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. UK-based real estate companies think 85% think that outside the UK is a better place to invest. I mean, that is absolutely wild. And so we really need to think about how to become really quickly more competitive. We've got a huge amount of work to do here. We talked earlier about the clear and consistent policy signals. We need to undo some of that damage. And I think, one of the reasons why I mentioned other sectors like transport and energy is because investors are looking at the whole piece. They're looking at the overall consistency of policymaking from government, because we're not just investing for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. This is long-term investments into the UK economy, and like it or not, the role of government is really important in the UK. That's the way the UK works. Other countries might like to believe that the government has almost no impact in the economy. That's definitely in the UK that is not the case. And to not have an industrial strategy is a really serious place to be. So we strongly think that we need to start looking at building an industrial strategy, having a plan for where we want to be on sustainability. Housing and buildings are a core part of that. And so those clear and consistent policy signals that give investors confidence that this is not just here until life gets difficult politically or until we get a bit too close to the nearest election. These are policy signals that are going to last the test of time, and ideally that all parties can sign up to. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is rather worryingly almost looking at net zero as something that might be optional for the UK, or something that we don't need to prioritize as strongly as other topics. Where we want to get to is a place where net zero and sustainability are absolutely built into all policymaking, and there's cross-party consensus that net zero is where we need to get to. But of course, how you then deliver net zero, well, that differs from one party to another. That's totally fine. But clearly, it can't happen without thinking about transport, buildings, and transport, buildings, and energy, and that's why we're talking about housing today. I think there's also really big challenges around skills. I'm sure we're going to come on and talk about skills at some point today. We also need to start thinking about mechanisms for homeowners to finance their housing, and so green mortgages, I think, have got a huge potential for the UK. And then finally, we need to talk about social housing, which is another really key area for trying to get huge amounts of private capital into the housing sector to do the retrofits that we need.
Kane?
So I think there are reasons to be positive, and James, you touched on that. There is a consensus built around aiming towards net zero. Particularly in an election year, there's a consensus around growth. Growth is one of the highest priorities amongst the major parties competing for people's votes at the moment, and sustainability is growth. If the government puts some funding into sustainable industries, then that will crowd in private investment, as we've seen in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, and as we are now seeing in the European Union as well. So there is a consensus around growth. There's also a consensus around energy costs. They're too high. We want to do something about that as a country. So that translates into GB Energy that was announced by the Labour Party, and yes, that's more to do with infrastructure, but then you look actually at the retail policy on energy costs, and that's things like insulation or heat pumps and how you can reduce household bills. And then also we do have a consensus now that post-COVID, working from home, that people really appreciate a good quality of life. So there are great opportunities now to argue for further densification of our cities, so making our buildings more sustainable because they're closer to transport and they're closer to work. So there are a lot of positive grounds of consensus at the moment. And then kind of looking at the key challenges for investment in housing. So James, you mentioned skills that we'll touch on later. There's also planning and funding. So planning is the really easy one, or much easier than the others, because with planning, it's really about how do you reform the civil service. So you don't need necessarily to bring on board lots of private sector stakeholders to make decisions on that or additional funding. So there are ways that you can reform the planning system through AI and tech that are really interesting, that can make some of these investments much more attractive to the private sector. So the Tony Blair Institute came out with a great report last year, and it touched more on major infrastructure, but basically they said any major infrastructure plans should be approved within 6 months. More recently, Britain Remade, a newish think tank, have been doing a lot of work on how to make the planning system much easier for housing. And I think that's one of the key components in making sustainable investment much more attractive to businesses investing in homes.
That's really great. Thank you both for those answers. Very broad, very sweeping. I think we've touched on.
Well, I think that's the challenge. There are a lot of things to do.
There's a lot to do.
Again, that's partly why what we're trying to do here is push 3 really kind of major topic areas that we want the next government, whoever the next government is, to focus on. And so that is, requirements around rented homes achieving EPC of C by 2035, increasing take-up of green mortgages, and then also securing longer-term rent settlements for social housing. And that's, so we've tried to distill the scale of this challenge down into bite-sized chunks, which we know none of which will be easy, but if those 3 things were really focused on,
there's no question our housing report could have been considerably longer than it is, that's for sure. Now I'm going to come on to talking about social housing in just a moment, but James, you've mentioned something which is green mortgages, and I think there's a little bit of a question here that I'd love you to just give us a couple of minutes of detail on, or just a few comments, because I think there's a little bit of a misconception, or perhaps there's a prevailing lack of understanding about what green mortgages are, what does it mean, what counts as a green mortgage and what doesn't. Is this a marketing thing? Is it a gimmick? So I want, if I may, to ask you to give us just a couple of comments about what are green mortgages, what would we like to see happen there, and what's the potential?
Yeah, green mortgages, to try and define green mortgages is an interesting thing, because currently, and this is one of the things that we actually flag in our report, is that there's no standardized definition of a green mortgage. And so on some levels, a green mortgage can mean anything that you want it to mean. And part of what we're trying to call for right now is to say, well, let's start off by creating a standardized definition of a green mortgage, so everybody knows what they're talking about. It all means the same thing, that people can start to get advice on what their green mortgage options are. But broadly speaking, speaking, a green mortgage offers better terms or lower rates or indeed extra borrowing capacity for those buying more energy efficient homes. And it does stand to reason, because generally a more energy efficient home is a better commercial prospect for a bank to lend against. It's usually a lower risk. It has often, most times, lower energy bills, which of course means that the people living in that house have less susceptibility to price shocks in energy that we've seen recently. And so, of course, you're able to get slightly better terms against that mortgage. Now, it does obviously stand to reason why that is why that should exist and why that should be the case. I think one of the challenges is that uptake is currently really low. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of brokers don't really know much about green mortgages. So 63% of brokers, in some statistics recently, said that their clients had not heard of green mortgages. And 90%, although that's despite 90% of large companies in UK real estate said they wanted to see more green mortgages in the UK. So there's clearly a demand from the real estate side to see more in the way of green mortgages. But brokers don't seem to be sharing that information, or clients don't seem to be asking about it. And so, which is strange, because if you think about the policy or the objective here, it's where the market makes sense to help move things forwards. It makes sense for banks to do more in terms of green mortgages because it's a lower risk product. It also you'd think makes sense for a consumer to look for a green mortgage product certainly on an energy efficient house, because it would be something that would be a lower cost. So clearly there should be a win-win there. So of course, how do we need to work on this? We need to, like I said, standardize the definition of green mortgages and get a lot more shared clarity on what a green mortgage is, and specifically what it isn't, but also signpost mortgage options, green mortgage options, to potential buyers. And so if somebody's buying a house, maybe one of the first questions that their mortgage company should be asking in a kind of mortgage calculator is, well, what is the EPC rating of this house? It starts to tie together the house's energy efficiency certificate, which, every house that's being sold has to have an EPC. Oftentimes it's just something else that's put into the blurb that the estate agent gives you as part of a house purchase. This makes it a much more important part of the process. It's like, oh, wow, okay, this is an EPCB. Wow, maybe I could get a much cheaper mortgage than I would be getting if I were buying the EPC E house that's on the next street along. These are really important components of why a green mortgage is so exciting. And I think hopefully should give current homeowners that are thinking about selling in the next few years a lot of incentive, alongside all the other benefits for retrofitting your house, but a lot of incentive to start building or bringing into place the features, the retrofits that might make sense, but also for new build options as well, because of course a green mortgage isn't just for an older building, it's for a new building too. So I think it does drive an incentive into the market. And the more we can see green mortgages move forwards, the better it would be.
These are very new, relatively new types of mortgages. So of course it's natural that there's an element of uncertainty or lack of awareness to begin with. But yeah, I think everything you've touched on there makes a lot of sense. I'd love to come on, if I may, to social housing.
Yeah.
I think social housing tenants, often facing the very brunt of the cost of living crisis, are facing huge energy bills, especially in homes with very poor insulation. So, Kane, perhaps I can start with you. I'd like to know more about how do we incentivize social housing landlords to upgrade and decarbonize these homes, and what are the main challenges we're facing in that area?
So with social housing, obviously we're talking about a myriad of different types of social housing. So you've got council housing that's controlled by local authorities, and then you've got housing associations, and then you've got some for-profit providers. So the finance and the funding available to each group varies slightly. There is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is great and has provided some funding to decarbonise existing social housing stock. We at YIMBY Alliance are looking at how we decarbonise social housing here in London. So estate renewal is a really exciting prospect. So we've seen that occur probably about 31 times, where estates have either retrofitted existing buildings and built additional social homes on the same estate site, or they've knocked down very poorly built aging buildings that are very energy inefficient and have awful conditions in it. So we know mould and damp is a huge issue in social housing stock. Most of our social housing stock in the UK is post-war, so built in the 1950s through to the early 1980s. And at that time, it was visionary and great. It gave people great places to live. Some of the spaces within the flats or homes are spacious, great. It alleviated overcrowding at the time. But now in 2024, many of those flats are overcrowded and they're really energy inefficient. So households are both overcrowded, so they've got poor standards of living, and also they're spending hundreds of extra pounds a year on heating their flats. So estate renewal will offer an exciting way to allow estates to have a vote to rebuild their existing stock and also build additional homes for people on the council house waiting list, and all at the same time using any private sales of flats to fund the decarbonisation of the estate. So you can get a flat that is much larger and that has a much better EPC rating, and it's all done with a bit of public funding, but mostly it's through private cross-subsidy of private sales. So I think that's a really great way to fund decarbonisation of homes, particularly in areas where homes are most in demand because the private sales will cross-subsidise. Other than that, in places where you won't have that cross-subsidy, I think we really need to see additional government funding that will crowd in private investment.
Really fascinating. Thank you.
Well, yeah,
James, can I invite you to?
Yeah,
to
of course.
on
And
that?
having, I live in Camden in London, and that's a council that's really taken up the estate renewal very strongly. And I've seen it in the area around me. Just some of the estate, refurbs in some senses and retrofits of some estates, and then completely restarting, from scratch in terms of others with much nicer, shinier, new. Well, certainly they look much nicer now, of course, but how they'll stand the test of time. But yeah, it's incredible the work that's going on. I think what we need to do is make this much more mainstream and much more, just happening across the country, and so figure out, what are the long-term settlements that are necessary to allow that investment to flow into these places. And I think one of the challenges that we have across sustainability more broadly is the idea that this can only happen if the public sector puts in all the money. And one of our messages at UKSIF is that if the government gets the conditions right, then we can attract private capital into this space. And we know that the public purse is currently very tight, that we also need to respond to things like the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is throwing a lot of subsidy out there. We can't necessarily do that in the same way. So we've got to find mechanisms to get large amounts of private capital into the system. And the social housing sector is no different to that. Of course, it needs to be responsible capital. It needs to be, capital that's not taking advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in society, and that's really important. But in order to get that money going into that, we need some long-term planning, and we need to figure out how to create incentives and structures for them.
Yeah, and it is what residents want. Residents want better homes, better insulation. They want to be more financially resilient. They don't want to think about heating costs going up in winter. So we see that in London, there were 31 ballots on estates to vote for estate renewal, and each one overwhelmingly passed with a huge majority. And it's great. It just shows that residents want it, voters want it. So we just need to be a bit more clever in how we think about leveraging public funding to crowd in some private investment.
Wow. Super interesting. I mean, I'd like to come on to now one of our final points. Obviously, we're getting close to the end of our time, but heat pumps. We've talked about them already. We hear about them, it seems like, every other week. There has even just very recently been announcements regarding an end to the boiler tax and making it supposedly easier and cheaper to install a heat pump. But the UK is installing heat pumps 10 times slower than France, for example. So what are we waiting for now to see mass uptake? What are the barriers, and are there any solutions? James, perhaps I can start with you.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, heat pumps we know are essential technology to build into the housing system. In some respects, a lot of the technology needed still needs to be developed. I live in a flat that I tried to get a heat pump and failed because the technical solution wasn't there. That was a few years ago, so hopefully that will have moved on a little bit. But I, there is a huge amount of the UK's housing stock that can take heat pumps and needs to and should take heat pumps. Part of what Kane was talking about earlier is the moving towards the widespread electrification of everything. And heat pumps do two things. One, it's a much more efficient way to generate heat because you are actually capturing the heat from that's ambient in the outside air, but it's also a way of electrifying heat. And so it almost kills two birds with one stone. We will lose our necessity to be reliant on imports of foreign fossil fuels, at the same time a much more efficient way to heat houses. And so heat pumps are such an important part of the solution here, but yet we're, as you say, still not getting to the level of heat pump installation that we need. One of the challenges, I think, is skills. And on some levels, you don't get better green jobs than retrofitting jobs. They can't be offshored. You can't outsource that job to another country or another place. It's right there. It's in that locality, and it's an incredible place to build a whole new skills base for the UK on retrofitting. And we could and should become a real global leader in this space. And then taking technology that we develop here in the UK to other countries, there's such a win-win from working on retrofitting and heat pumps. The Construction Industry Training Board states that we will need 12,000 workers to be trained every year for the next 4 years to improve the energy efficiency of buildings in the UK. That's a lot of jobs, a lot of opportunity, and so we've just got to get on with it. We've got to reduce the backlog. We've got to get the training done. 85% of the UK's large real estate companies said that they believe retrofitting training hubs, which is a policy that we're calling for in this housing report, which would reduce heat pump installation delays, would have a positive impact on companies investing in sustainable real estate in the UK. This is the sort of evidence that we need to get out there to show and to highlight just the importance of government taking action. If government supports the upskilling, if government supports the technology, the market, the private sector and the companies that are working on this can take over and move this forwards and work in partnership with government. There's I keep going back to the win-wins here, but there's so many positive opportunities.
Kane, a rallying cry. Any response?
Yeah, so it's incredibly exciting, James. And Liza, you mentioned earlier that I'm chair of my residents association, and we actually live in a building that currently the housing association is looking at installing heat pumps. And it's terrific because we could get our heating costs down to, a few hundred, if not nil, basically, if you do it really right. So there's a really exciting offer there, both from the private sector, where there's the offer of, going in, transforming people's homes, and also creating those tens of thousands of jobs that you mentioned. But as well for public policy, that we can help people become more financially resilient, and we can improve the quality of our homes. So at the moment, I think there are only 2,000 people employed in the heat pump sector in Great Britain. And there's just a phenomenal potential there to scale it up and provide those tens of thousands of jobs. The difficulty will be at what pace. So that's where clarity on government policy is really helpful, and clarity on where the funding will be for ideas such as hubs. So I know, sometimes I get very curious looking at sustainability policy in my day job as a researcher. So I often think, what if I retrained as a heat pump technician? And it's actually incredibly difficult to find a course. And that will be an issue for the next government, but also a really exciting one. And particularly if you look at the Labour Party, who are looking at at doing a new deal for working people and how they can create a new generation of skilled jobs. These are just jobs sitting on the table that consumers want, the private sector wants, and that is great in terms of public policy. So I think we need to figure out how we're going to do it at pace.
Sure.
Soon.
I mean, pace and scale is what you really just talked about. It's something we talk about quite often, which is, are we working at the pace that we need to? Probably not. Are we working at the scale that we need to? Well, 2,000 people installing heat pumps for the entire of the UK doesn't feel like remotely the scale we need. So I think it just stands to reason how big the opportunity here is, but also how much it needs to be scaled up to achieve that and to deliver on that opportunity. But the opportunity is absolutely enormous. The Green Jobs Task Force pledged to support 250,000 jobs by 2030, and with homes and buildings as a priority area for investment. So there is the policy underpinning for some of this, but it needs to be really accelerated and brought forward to get to the pace and scale that we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are great green jobs, and they're jobs of the future. They're jobs that are going to last and be around for a long time and pay well. So this is, absolutely. I love that both of you have sort of brought out the different points there. And with that, I'm afraid we've actually reached the end of our time. Thank you both so much for your insights. Particular thanks go to you, Kane. Thanks for joining us as our guest. The Housing Report can now be found on the UK SIF website on our policy page. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes in UK SIF news. You can always find us on LinkedIn or Twitter @UK SIF. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. You'll hear from us again very soon.